Hello, you beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of the Roaring Agents podcast. I have Nick Krautter here. He is a grizzled veteran of real estate and the author of The Golden Handoff. He came back. We've had him on previously. He's going to talk about updated version and talk about some other things about the market that I think is going to really help us. Welcome, Nick.
Mike, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So tell me what's new.
What's new is I have been interviewing top agents from all over the country because I am going to be doing the second edition to the Golden Handoff. Something I learned after I wrote it and started presenting all over the country was that not every agent wants to just pick a day and retire. A lot of people want to do some stuff. They want to work with the people they like, when they want to work, on the types of properties they like working on. And so I've been learning more and more about how people are implementing what I call a partial handoff. My experience early on was that agents that came to me and sold me their businesses were 100% done. You know, they were retired, that was it. And I think more and more now I'm realizing the biggest opportunity out there to implement the golden handoff is not with just those people, but with all the folks that are thinking of retiring eventually and want to have a little bit of action in the game. Basically, they want to still have like one foot in the boat, one on the dock, and there's a lot of different ways to help facilitate that so that eventually you're helping all those clients, but initially you take on a little bit of it, or you're selling a little part of your business over time. So I wanted to share some ideas I've got and things I've learned in interviewing people.
That makes a lot of sense for anyone who's got a business that's big enough to hand off or sell. They had to enjoy it at some level. So I could see a good portion of them saying, well, I still want to dabble. I still want a piece of it, whatever. So this makes complete sense. So
Yeah.
how does that differ from a full handoff, the partial handoff?
Yeah, I mean, a full handoff is what it sounds like. So you basically pick a time frame where the new agent, the adopting agent, takes over 100%, and they're responsible for all of the marketing, all of the communication, all the client care, all the actual real estate activity, all the listings, all of the tours, all the offers. And the retiring agent gets referral income from that. And what we're finding and what I'm seeing over and over again is that agents, whether they say it consciously or not, really kind of choose to phase out, right? So they kind of slowly stop marketing. They continue to work with their core group of people. They don't work as many hours. They don't do as much marketing. They don't do as much prospecting. And a lot of agents eventually just end up kind of, well, if someone calls me, I'll take care of it, but I'm not going to really push. Now, the negative of that is that let's say you're an agent that's been doing 30 million in sales your whole career, or let's say you've been doing that for a while. And now, 2 years ago you did 20 million and this year you're going to do 10. Well, generally speaking, your clients are still doing 30 million in business. It's just you're doing the 10 million of the people that call you, and that 20 million now is being handled by someone else. And so if you're in a retiring agent or you're phasing out and you do it that way, your business is worth less and less over time. Whereas if you choose to hand it off while it's still going full speed ahead, you're still doing 30 million a year, and someone jumps in and takes over and adopts your client list, it will have way more value for both of you when you've maintained those relationships. And so a partial handoff is a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can still do the 10 million you want to do, whether that's, for example, here's a real obvious one. Most people eventually want to focus on listings and they don't want to run all over town with buyers, right? When you build a team, that's usually the first agent you hire, right, as a buyer's agent. And so you could either build a team and hire them, and essentially you're retiring from being a buyer's agent. You're just doing it in the context of a team. Or you could have someone adopt all of those people and handle all that business. And now you're just a listing agent, but you're still getting referral income from all those buyers that would have gone and picked a different agent because you weren't talking to them or you weren't following up fast enough. And you pick someone that's excited about that. That's like, I love working with buyers. I want to be busy. I want to do as many deals as possible, and have them adopt that part of your business. And there's a lot of ways that this shows up. So kind of the initial one is that, like, that's usually what people typically do is you pick a portion of your business and say, I really want to focus over here, whether that's price point, property type, neighborhood, whether it's buyers or sellers. You pick an aspect of the business that you want to focus on, and then you essentially sell the part you don't want to work on, as opposed to letting it just wither away and go away on its own, which is what ends up happening to so many realtors that don't
Yeah, I love this
choose.
idea because that they have quiet quitting in the corporate world, but this is
Yeah.
like quiet retiring, and there's like, well, I'm just going to pull back, and I can see them not even realizing they're doing it consciously. It's like, no, I've raised my standards. I'm not going to go further out than this or whatever, and they don't really know how else they can get that business necessarily. I really like this idea.
Yeah, I think that's the best way I've heard it described is quiet retiring. And I joke that no one in real estate wants to raise their hand and says I'm retiring in 2 years, because they're worried that people won't want to list with them or won't want to work with them.
Right.
And that really isn't true. I mean, if your clients want to buy or sell this year and you're still working full steam ahead, then it probably doesn't matter to the client, but it definitely matters to the agents, and certainly their fears or egos cause that quiet retiring. And that's what people have been doing forever. That's why I wrote the book, is that there is an option that is not a huge, massive process or task. It's a simple, repeatable process. You're essentially referring your clients to an agent you know and trust, and they're agreeing to maintain those relationships and pay a referral fee. And that's the essence of the whole golden handoff. It's not you know too hard to implement. It's something that we do all the time when we refer a client out.
Right.
um, I'm working after this on finding a referral for a client in the Midwest, because they've got some properties they want to sell, and we've got history, and they want me to interview people for them. And so I'm excited for that opportunity, and I'm sure that referral fee will be bigger than some of the sales I do, and it will take a lot less effort and work to help those people and make sure they're taken care of. So there's a couple other ways. So picking an aspect or a part of your business to hand off to another solo agent or team is I think the easiest, most obvious one. But there's other ways that this shows up too. I was talking to a really long tenured Portland broker who's very much historically been like the top historic home sales guy in Portland. And he knows more about the history of the neighborhoods and the homes and the architects than anyone, period, in the market. He's an avid fan of that aspect of the real estate world, and he's really good at it. And earlier on in my career, I had talked about taking over his business, and at the time he was a significantly bigger producer than I was. And so in that instance, we had discussions. He's still working, by the way. He's never going to quit, but of what it would look like for me to take over his business. And that involved me joining his team, moving to that brokerage, learning the history of the neighborhoods and the properties over time. Because for him, his clients hired him because he knew this unique aspect about the real estate market in Portland. And so for him, he wanted to bring on an apprentice to train them on his special secret, weapon, which was his knowledge of the history and the pedigree of these homes, and teach someone that and eventually have them take over. It didn't end up that we ended up not doing that. As my business grew, I didn't want to make that big of a change just for that opportunity. And I think it was better for both of us, because I don't think he really wanted to let it go. But he has a team, and I think he's got someone that's taking on more and more responsibility now. But we were talking over 10 years ago. The flip side is you could be a retiring agent that has had a team or has had assistants or transaction coordinators or whatever, and you join someone else's team that already has all those pieces in place, where you can let go of a lot of the different systems and processes, and maybe you handle the people you want, your repeat and referral clients you handle, and then you refer out the rest to the team that you join, where someone else is in charge of hiring and training and payroll and all of those different management tasks that maybe you just don't want to be responsible for anymore, which eventually I think everyone gets to that point where they would love to either get big enough or small enough that they don't have to deal with that kind of stuff anymore. Because if you're in the middle, you got to deal with it. And it is a hassle. It's not the funnest part of running a business. Another way I've seen people do this that I think is really interesting is, so it's either you join their team or potentially they come and take over your business as an apprentice. But there's another thing that someone called an honorary team member. And that's where someone loves talking to people and engaging with their clients, but they just don't want to do the work, or they're going to move. And so they won't be able to go to the listing appointments or go to the showings. And so the way that works, which is really interesting, is you join a team, but instead of maybe doing the listings and referring out the buyers, you're actually just kind of what they call an honorary team member, where you're there, you keep your license, and you're still talking to people, and you're still doing lead generation and client relationship building and maintenance, but you're referring out the actual listing, buying, transaction work to someone else on the team. And I think that's a really cool way to do it if you want to stay engaged, or if that's the part of the business you enjoy. That certainly speaks to me. I love the communication and conversation and masterminding and workshopping all these ideas, but going to a bunch of inspections is at this point, after doing over 1,000 deals, is not as exciting for me anymore as it was when I was newer. And one of our brokers today got his first deal accepted, so he's like over the moon and really excited, and I'm excited for him. And I guarantee you, if you're kind of in that level where you're burned out, there's still plenty of agents that are newer to the business that are excited about growing and pushing their boundaries and have a lot to prove. They still want to do X million in sales or X number of deals and get to the certain rank in their market. And finding that person before you let your business wither away is really super important.
Well, you mentioned ego before, and I have to imagine, even talking to someone, hey, what you thinking about? I'm never going to retire. You kind of like when you call, I don't know if you ever called FSBOs, but they're taking me out of here feet. Well, not FSBOs, but just a circle call around is like, they're taking me out of here feet first. I'm going to die in this home. And
Yeah.
I think real estate agents can be that way. How should someone approach someone else about this? And what have you found works in that approach?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you two approaches. So the first one is the general approach, which is, now let's say someone had a relationship, like you and I have talked before, we know each other. It might be something as simple as, hey, Mike, I got recommended this really great book called The Golden Handoff, and I read it over the weekend, and made me think a lot about my business. And I'm curious, you've had a great career. What are your plans with your business when you're done selling? And 99% of agents don't have a plan. And so it's an open-ended question, and you can provide a solution or help someone. Because it's like, most people are going to say something like this: well, I'm going to probably just wind it down, and then if someone calls me, I'll refer it to a friend at the office.
Yeah.
And that's what most people say. But again, if you get to that point, you've been consciously or unconsciously operating at a lower level, or ignoring people, or not being proactive about growing your business.
Reactive versus proactive, right?
Yeah. So your business has been shrinking, right? Your clients don't want to bother you, so they work with different agents, or they just haven't heard from you. They don't even know if you're in business anymore, so they call one of the other 5 agents they know on their speed dial, and you miss out on that opportunity. So wouldn't you rather make sure that those people who have given you this amazing career, one, that they have an agent that they know and trust that can do a good job, and would it benefit you to have that referral income? And I've had a couple people say, look, I've got 50 rental houses and I've made a ton of money and I don't need the money. It's like, okay, well, that's good for you for planning ahead and not being one of those realtors that's in their 70s or 80s and they're still living commission to commission because they never bought a rental. They never invested any of their money. Everything, I had a mentor that said, don't be like me. Everything I've earned, I'm wearing or driving. I'll remember that forever, because he didn't buy his first investment property until he was probably close to 60 years old. And I bought my first investment property when I was 28. There's a huge difference that happens when you get 30 years of appreciation working for you through different market cycles. There was points where my rental properties were completely upside down, you know, and my personal residence was upside down. And you just wait. And guess what? Then they, time happens, interest rates go down, COVID happens, and prices go up. And so over time, it makes people look real smart. But if you don't get started early, you could end up in that position. But for that person who was like, I'm rich as hell and I don't care, was, well, what would it look like if you could donate an extra $100,000 a year to your favorite charity or church or your university or something else that you care about that you already support? And this could just go to that. In fact, you don't even have to keep a license. I'll just sign an agreement that I'll use the referral fees in that amount to donate to the charity of your choosing.
Interesting.
So there's ways to get around like any objection, if you think about it. Now, the second way is if someone's kind of hanging on and still doing it, is to actually appeal to that ego, right? And the way I would do that is, let's say, Mike, you're in that position. You're like, I'm going to keep going. I love this business and I'm going to keep doing it. And I've got some great clients. And it's like, Mike, you know what? You've had an amazing career and done a great job. And you deserve to work with the people you want and on the deals you want. But for everything else that you don't want to work on, or the people you really don't want to call back, or the first time buyer that wants to look way, way out on Sunday morning at some suburban properties an hour from your house, wouldn't it be great to have someone who's excited about that opportunity help with that? I would love to help all the people you don't want to work with, so you can focus on the stuff you love and the people you love working with and only do that. What would that sound like? And so that appeals to the ego, right? It's like you've gotten to a point where you don't have to do everything. And that truly is a sense of accomplishment, right? If you're not having to say yes to every single person in every single deal, I hope that you're at a point where you've done enough and made enough money that you can actually choose who to work with. Whereas a new agent, I honestly think you probably should say yes to everything and get the experience and learn some stuff the hard way and work with some difficult clients on some hard deals. You haven't earned the right to just pick and choose the stuff you want at that point, I don't think. But eventually, if you get to that point, as opposed to letting the 20 or 30 million of sales just walk out the door with some other random agent, why don't you let me take care of it and pay you referral fees? And then you can keep doing the stuff you were going to do anyway. So there's lots of different ways to do that, whether it's with a team or an individual agent or some kind of hybrid. I sold my residential business last year, and it was to a team because it was almost 700 people that we had worked with and stayed in touch with and stayed engaged with. And so it didn't make sense to just pick one agent. It would be too much.
Right.
I couldn't, we never helped that many people by me working by myself. That was created with a team in the first place of a bunch of people working together to collaborate and help people, because it's way too much for one agent. And so I didn't have an expectation that one agent could handle that kind of growth and that kind of responsibility to try to maintain that many relationships. So I had to find another team that was built to manage that kind of communication and workload.
I've got a third approach people can do to talk to someone else about selling their business. To buy your book and give it to the other agent and say, look, I read this. You should read it too. When the time's right, call me.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Honestly, the book started out as a white paper, which if you don't know what that is, it's just a fancy way of saying it's like a long article or a short book. And I originally started doing that as something to give away to people in my market in Portland, as just hey, I'm doing this, here's how it works, and I'd love to talk to you when you're ready. And it's funny because I remember when the book came out, I had a realtor come up to me after a presentation I did in Portland where I work and live. And they said, well, why did you write this book? Now everyone can do this. And I said, well, that's great, but I can't possibly take over every retiring agent's business. There's probably 1,000 agents a year retiring just in our city. And so the chance of me managing that growth is laughable. So it's okay. I'm okay with some people working with different agents, but it's a great strategy and it's easy. It's just, you can send it to them on Amazon or grab a lunch and hand them a copy. And I use it all the time. That's a big piece of how I grew my business.
Well, the other part is few people implement. And so it doesn't matter that this book is out there. You're not going to have a ton of competition because they're not the ones going at it like you. They're going to be few and far between. I
Yeah.
remember we were in a class, it's like 300 people at Greenwood Inn over here in Beaverton. And some guy was up there telling all these tactics. Someone raised their hand. It's like, you just told all of us, if we all go do it, it's not going to work. He goes, I'm going to tell you, 3 of you are going to do this at best. So don't think that this is all of a sudden going to become a saturated market. Anyone who wants to run with this implement, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I tell people, I think there's a lot of anxiety about how to approach retiring agents. That's why I've got scripts and dialogues about how to do it. And I think I was probably nervous when I first started doing it. I mean, my first one, I wasn't nervous because I didn't even think about it. One of my friends was getting a corporate job again, and she's in the book, Renee. And I said, hey, can I help your clients? And I just said that. I didn't have like a big plan. The plan came after she finally said yes 6 months later, and we had to figure out, okay, how do we do this? And that was kind of the kernel that grew into the tree that's the book now, which is, the systems and process and all the stuff I learned the hard way is hopefully mapped out. But you're right, most people won't implement it. And I tell people, I'm like, this is going to be the easiest sale of your life, because these agents who are retiring don't think they have something that's worth money, and you're going to show them it's actually worth a lot and that it's easy and you can help them take care of it. And the clients are happy and they get referral income. I can't overstate how much of a life-changing thing this can be for people who are retiring. I talk about it in the book, but Renee, she told me a year later that her husband had lost his job. When I took over her business, it was 2010. We were in a very bad recession. And a lot of people had lost their jobs and had to move, and homes were underwater. And so a lot of people's, not only were they not getting paid as much, or they lost their jobs, but the equity they had in their homes was gone or was less. So there was just way less of a safety net. And she said, I know it's not a ton of money, but every month I can count on one thing closing and I get $2,000 or $3,000. And that's how we've been able to stay in our home. It's paid our mortgage this last year. And it means so much that we can stay in our house and in our community and keep our kids close to the school so they can walk to school. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't had this income. And I was like, wow, I was having fun growing my business and it felt good to pay those referral fees, but I didn't realize it mattered that much.
Yeah.
And, because for every person that's got the 50 rentals and millions of dollars and they don't need it, there's 98 people that don't have that. And that this, whatever amount it comes out to, whether it's an extra 10 or 15,000 or an extra 200,000 a year of referral fees, is life-changing and is very meaningful. And so that's why I'm passionate about sharing this and continuing. It's been 8 years since the book came out. It's going to be almost a decade here really soon. It's crazy how fast that goes. And it's so great. The biggest reward I get is when someone emails and says, hey, I sold my business and we used your book and it's worked out great. And thank you so much for sharing this. Because we didn't know what to do, and it really laid it out for us how to do this, and it's been successful. And that just makes me so happy, because if someone emails me, there's 10 other people that have done it that just thought they didn't want to bother me or thought I was hard to get a hold of. And I try to always respond to those and thank people for reaching out, because it's my favorite part about having written the book.
You mentioned that a lot of people just say, hey, I've got some friends in the office. I've got this, I've been friends for 20 years with this person. I'm going to give it to them. I think the difference between what you do and what that is that unfortunately, a lot of people treat real estate as a hobby a lot more than a business. And what you do is you keep it a business in that you have a plan on how to reach these people. That agent who's just going to give the deals to his friend it's reactive. Business is proactive. And I think there's a huge mistake in that for the people who really do care about their clients. If you aren't having someone go and serve them and you're just waiting for them to call you, you've really kind of let them down and let anyone else go out and try to get them. I just think that this is a business level decision instead of it being a hobby. You're like, well, okay, if they call me, I'll go out and show homes or I'll send them off. So I like this. That's very it's still serving the client, which is what most of us got into real estate do, is to help people. And this does that.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you make a really good point about how, and especially if it's like friends or family, sometimes people are very casual about it. I feel like I've lost a handful of deals because someone's cousin or uncle got their real estate license and they wanted to hire them to kind of help them out.
Yeah.
And then you get a call after they close and they're like, man, that was horrible. And now I don't want to go to Thanksgiving or with this family strife because they really dropped the ball or didn't know what they were doing. And, it's too important of a decision to like work with someone you don't fully trust when you're buying or selling a property. Because for most people, it's their biggest asset. And a good agent can move the needle up or down, whether you're trying to buy better or sell higher and get the terms and the process and get it done, get the deal closed. I think that the best way to go about that is when you're talking to someone about taking over your business, whether that's partially or completely, is you need to sit down with your marketing plan and look back at a couple years of closings and where did your business come from really? How much was repeat and referral? How much was open houses, sign calls, marketing, social media, web, wherever your business comes from, like what percentage comes from what activity? And then look at the adopting agent. What is your marketing plan? How often do you call your past clients? How often do you email? Do you do client events, trainings, classes? Do you do a newsletter? How active are you on social media? And make sure it matches up so that your expectations are being met. That again, I see the big divide I see with older and younger agents is how they communicate. And so you don't want to get blindsided selling your business to someone who leverages social media and text messaging and bulk communication to maintain their relationships if you've spent your whole career having one-on-one conversations with people. Because I know this sounds crazy, but a lot of clients out there don't have social media. And guess who owns a lot of real estate? Older people who don't feel the need to change. They don't have any social media, much less the newest version of whatever the newest thing is. We still have a fax number, for God's sakes, because we have a couple clients that don't even have email. And guess what they own? They own a lot of real estate, and they know other people who own a lot of real estate.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you want to do business with them, you're meeting in person, or they're going to fax you or mail you something, and you got to deal with it. So you want to make sure that, for me, it was really critical that the agents that took over my business committed to calling everyone at least once a year and checking in. Like an actual telephone call where you use your phone to talk to another person that's talking to you, not texting, not email, not social media. Let's go do all that. Let's leverage video. Let's do all those things. But I don't want to rely on it because to me, the most powerful thing is to have a conversation and ask great questions and to really try. Sales at the end of the day is just understanding people, understanding what their motivation is and what their goals are, and finding a way that you can help them achieve those in a way that maybe they didn't know that was available to them. And the golden handoff is a great way to do that too. It's, hey, most people got into real estate because it's a good career. They love real estate or houses, or they want to be in a career where they really control their own destiny. But at some point, they're going to want to retire, or they're going to want to slow down and do less. And this creates a huge opportunity to help those people and to help their clients. And so I'm really excited about sharing the ideas in the partial handoff because it really opens a door to starting sooner and helping more people who are in that boat. Like you said, that I'm never going to quit 100%, but you're definitely going to slow down. And so doing that sooner than later maintains so much of those relationships and so much of that value that they have.
You mentioned, helping people with their goals with things they may not have seen. And I know that you know a lot about creative financing. I know
Yeah.
it's gotten, the mortgage availability index is at the lowest it's ever been. Things are as tight as they've ever been. People still want to buy homes. What are some of those creative ways out there that you know about that the average person doesn't?
Yeah. So one thing is some loans are assumable by the buyer, where they don't have to go get a new loan, that they just officially take over the loan that the buyer currently has. Now,
Really?
not every,
I thought they cut all those out after the 80s because that's what everyone did with those interest
so
rates.
what they were doing then was what's called a wrap. And a wrap is basically an unofficial way to do that, which may or may not be legal. And so you need to look at your loan documents. I see a lot of people on social media. I think that the word they're using is buying a property subject to existing financing. So it's a subject to purchase. And it probably isn't kosher with the lender. There are ways that people choose to do it. The risk is that the loan could get accelerated. And what that means is they call you up and say, please pay us all the money we've loaned you back.
The fast acceleration.
Yeah. And so if you don't have the proceeds available to do that, or the buyer doesn't, then it can be risky. Now, I had a very high net worth client sell a very large mansion on a wrap. And the reason he did it is because he had a 3% loan and the buyer was willing to pay him 5% for, I think, 2 or 3 years until they refinanced the property. And the buyer was legitimate. The seller was very, very high net worth. So he said, look, if the bank calls me, I'll write him a check. Not a lot of people have $2 million lying around to just wire the money, pay off the loan. And now you're just private financing, right? Now you're just getting your 5% on the seller loan. So I don't want to go into too much detail about how to do wraps because I think in most cases it's too high risk for people.
Right.
If you have a client asking to do that, I would highly encourage you to get an attorney involved to help them at least understand the risk if they choose to do it. But I believe there are still loans. I know in the commercial world, there absolutely are assumable loans.
Okay.
I believe FHA and VA are often assumable. So understanding the rules on that. The trick there is that if the property is appreciated, the loan amount might be low, so your down payment's higher. You might be able to get the seller to carry a second loan so that basically buyer puts a down payment, they assume the first position loan, and then there's a second position with the seller that maybe has a different payoff schedule, or maybe you do a 5-year loan on the second, and then you just take over the original note and eventually pay that off. And so that to me is the cleanest thing, is when you actually do an official assumption of an existing loan. And the thing is, no one's talked about this for pretty much my whole career, because when I started, my first loan was 7.25% on my first house. That was in 2006. And I think the best rate you could get then was probably 6 or 6.5. Because I remember I refinanced it later at like 5.9, and my lender was like high-fiving everyone in the office and like, yes, under 6. And it's so funny because I think people now like go, oh, gosh, when I bought it was 11% or 20% or whatever it was in the 80s when houses cost $20,000. And it's like, that's great, but I'll buy a house all day long for 40 grand if the mortgage is 12%, but that $40,000 house now is worth $500,000. It's a whole different animal. So I think that people are way too casual about, oh, back in the day rates were higher. It's like, well, yeah, but values were way lower and affordability was different. And that's the key you just mentioned, is the price of the property is essentially irrelevant, right? You can't talk about home values if you don't also talk about incomes and mortgage rates. Because really is, what percentage of my income am I spending on my mortgage? And that's affordability, right? And so we've had hyper affordability for a while because rates were so low. Now rates are back to kind of more of a traditional historical norm. But what the problem is prices went way up based on low rates, and incomes haven't necessarily gone up enough to make up for that change, right? When rates double, you can't raise your income enough to make up for that overnight. It takes a long time. And prices haven't come down. We're seeing the West Coast, a lot of the tech cities are seeing pretty big price declines. But the Midwest and the East side of the country is the values are maintaining or going up because there's just no inventory. And so the question is like, well, how do you convince someone to sell their house with a 3% mortgage and then go buy one with 6? And creative financing gives you ways to not do that. So if you can do a traditional assumption, that's fantastic. What a lot of folks do though is just a seller carried loan. So maybe the owner has a very small mortgage amount, or they paid their home off and they own it, call it free and clear, meaning they'd have no mortgages. That seller could offer to carry the loan and basically sell the property and then be the bank. There are 2 ways to do that. The one that I would recommend you do is called a note and trust deed. And that means basically the seller sells their property and they sign a promissory note with the buyer, who is now the borrower and owner of the home. And they say, okay, I'm going to sell you my house for $600,000. You're going to put $100,000 down, which the seller gets at closing. And then the seller's going to carry a loan in the amount of $500,000. And maybe they say, I'm only going to charge you 5%, and it's going to be interest only for the first 2 or 3 years. So your payment is going to be way lower. And then maybe it switches to amortized, or maybe it's interest only for 5 years, and then you have to refinance the $500,000 loan. There isn't a lot of good reason on a short-term loan to pay down principal. It doesn't make a ton of sense.
Yeah.
So a couple of different strategies with private loans is, because you control the amortization period, or whether it's interest only or not, and you control the rate, and you control when it's due, you can use those variables to tune the mortgage to work for both the buyer and the seller. So for example, if let's say we're doing an owner carry on an apartment building, and let's say that owner hasn't raised rents in a long time, which is something we see a lot. It's like, well, my loan's paid off and I make enough money, I don't want to raise the rents too much. Well, no one can go get a new loan and qualify the building because the rents are too low for what the owner wants to sell the building for, right? Because they don't want to sell the building at a discount. They want market price, but they've got below market rents. Well, the way you can solve that problem is the owner can carry the loan, and you can set it up so that the owner is actually collecting more income net, because now they don't have to pay the water bill and the taxes and insurance and maintenance. You can set it up so that the buyer gets a below market rate loan, the seller gets more net income, and everyone wins. Because you could change, are we going to make it a longer, are we going to make it a lower rate? Maybe we make it interest only until the rents get up. So maybe it takes you 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on what city you're in. There's limits on how much you can raise rents. And even if you're in a city that or area that has no legal rent increase caps, you have market rate that you could raise rents for wherever you want in some markets, but it doesn't mean that the people can afford it. So you're either going to have turnover or you're going to have vacancy, and you're going to have to lower your rents to get back to market rate vacancy. So again, the thing that's important about that is you can change the down payment, the length of the loan, when it's due, what the interest rate is it interest only or not? So that you have all these different variables that when you go and do private financing, you can work with and be creative and find ways to make that work for both the buyer and the seller. I also did a deal once where the buyer didn't have enough down payment. And so we did a structured down payment where they put 10% down at closing, and then they paid the loan like normal to the owner, or the seller rather. And then the next year they had a balloon payment for 5% more. And then the next year they had another payment for 5% more. And so eventually, basically it took 2 years, because it was closing, got 10%, and a year they got another 5. And at the end of 2 years, they got the other 5. So they agreed to wait to get their full 20% down. And it meant that the buyer could buy the property, start collecting rent, start doing improvements, raise the rents, fill the vacant spaces, and start operating the building, and start building. In their case, they were building equity too, right? The property was going up in value as they fixed the problems and raised the rents. And the owner got to just walk away and get the payments. And so it worked out great for both people. It was such a good deal that I realized that if I had just used my commission, I could have probably bought the building for almost nothing. And unfortunately, I worked out a great deal for my buyer, and my commission was nice on the deal too. I think it was $1 million sale, but man, I think he made $2 million on that deal by the end of the time when he finally sold it. I was like, I should have bought this thing. What was I thinking? So that's another thing for everyone that's listening that's an agent, right? You might have a deal you work out for a buyer and they just get cold feet, or they don't get approved for their financing, or can't work out a deal they're happy with, but you're thinking, geez, this is the deal of the year. And if they back out, you can just, you could negotiate, hey, once we're going to terminate this deal and I'm going to sign another deal to buy it, because I think I want this property. It's a great deal. I talked to an agent that every property they owned was something that a buyer had gotten a great deal and just wasn't happy enough and walked away. And they went, gosh, I can't find a better deal anywhere. I'm going to buy this thing. And, you're going to find opportunities like that if you keep your ears and eyes open.
That's amazing.
Mike, do you have any other questions or things you've heard about creative financing or ideas? So I mentioned note and trust deed. That's kind of the most traditional way. When you buy a property and you get a loan through a big bank, you sign a promissory note, and then there's a trust deed. The trust deed gives the lender the right to foreclose on the property and says what happens if you're late and all that stuff. The promissory note says the interest rate, the loan amount, and when it's due. So if you think about it, the note is the IOU and the trust deed is the security that says I can foreclose or accelerate the loan if you're in breach of contract or
The lease option is the only thing. The other thing that I've seen, and I've seen it work and I've seen it not work. Back in 2010 when everything was squirrely, I actually had a client who did not know because he wasn't tracking his credit. He paid everything on time, and we went to go apply for a loan. He had forgotten that he had a Discover card that he had a fraud alert on, and he was paying. Well, they were charging him $10 a month, but because he never used the card, when he got the statement every month, he just threw it away because, well, I don't charge anything on it, so there's nothing there. This is blank.
Oh no.
He'd been nailed $10 a month plus the late fee plus all this, and his credit had just sunk to nothing. Well qualified if it wasn't for that. So we had to quickly figure out a lease option of this house in Lake Oswego that he got.
Yeah.
And then someone else, they were selling to their friend, and the only way they could afford it is by doing this lease option.
Yeah.
As would often happens with the friends kind of situations where you're bailing them out, they couldn't keep going and they had to take the house back. But
Yeah.
you never know which one will happen. But then she got to sell it for a little bit more a year later.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
And I mean, if they haven't damaged the house, it can work out. But so I'll say this about a lease option, because we've done a handful of these. And I think sometimes I got really good advice early, and I've seen agents mess this up. So when you do a lease option to purchase, there's three things you're doing. So you've got your lease, which says, here's how much I'm renting the property for and for how long. Make sure that when you do that, if you're going to have some of those lease payments be a credit to the down payment, you got to say that somewhere. And you probably want to also tie the lease to the purchase agreement and to the option agreement, meaning you want to mention the other agreements in each agreement so that in the lease you say, this lease is part of an option to purchase. And then, so you've got your lease. So that's number one. Make sure you specify whether the payments or part of the payments are going as a credit to the down payment. I've had people just assume that it is or assume that it isn't. You want to make sure you spell it out. The second thing you have is the option agreement. Now, the option agreement means you pay a fee, which is an option fee, to have the right to purchase the property for a set amount of time, whether that's a year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. The longer the term, typically the higher the fee is, or sometimes people do it where each year you pay an additional fee to extend it up to 3 years or up to 5 years or whatever you agree to. I like that way to do it because you're not paying all of it up front. Maybe you pay $10,000 up front and then you pay $5,000 each year. And whether you buy the property or not, the money goes to the seller. If you buy the property, those option fee payments, you want to specify that they're part of the total payment that the owner is going to receive. Now, the owner might say, no, they're separate, and it's those fees are different than the purchase. But again, if I'm negotiating for a buyer, I want to say that those option fee payments are applied to the earnest money or the down payment. And if what the seller gets is if the buyer doesn't buy the property, they just keep the option fees, right? That's the risk that the buyer's taking, is that those monies go away if they don't exercise their option. And every option that's how it works, whether you have options to buy stocks or buy real estate. Where I see people mess this up the most is they don't do the sale agreement. So please, God, please, don't say like, hey, we can buy the property for $500,000. We have 5 years. I had a deal for a medical office, and they didn't spell out the sale agreement. when they did the lease and the option to purchase. They did the lease, they did the option, but they didn't do the sale agreement. And they both lawyered up, and it took months. I'm not exaggerating, months, 2 or 3 months of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over this sale agreement. And it should never have been that hard, because what they did is in the option agreement, they said, hey, when we notify you, we've got 90 days to close and here's the price. But then there was nothing about contingencies. There was nothing about financing. There was nothing about anything. And so everything else was left up to debate. So what you want to do when you do a lease option to purchase is make sure you have a lease that's for the term of the option agreement. So don't get in a situation where like your lease is for a year, but you have 5 years to buy it. Make sure that your lease covers that time frame. If the payments on the lease are going to apply or partially apply to the down payment, make sure it says that in the lease and in the option agreement and in the contract. Make sure your option agreement is clear, that it says, you know, here's the property, the purchase price, the option fee, and the amount of time the buyer has to exercise their option. And the last step is fill out the entire sale agreement and have it crystal clear what all the contingencies are, all the timelines. So obviously you can't put a date on it, but you say from the time the buyer exercises their option, it will trigger the start dates. So now the contract says that the buyer has 60 days to close and 10 or 15 days for inspections. Depending on the property you're buying, you might have a traditional residential sale with, you know, a 10-day inspection and title and a 30 or 40-day close. If you're doing a commercial deal, though, you might have a 60-day due diligence window and a 90-day closing period for financing. So just make sure that your timelines work and that your contingencies are spelled out. And again, you can't put the dates, but you can put the timelines from mutual acceptance, or what some people call the effective date. And that would be when the buyer and the option holder notifies the seller that they're going to exercise their option under their option agreement for that contract. And so the more you can get nailed down up front, the less likely you are to end up in a position where you're negotiating all these other aspects of the contract because you didn't pre-negotiate it when you did the lease and the option. And so I highly recommend that you try to do all of that. Another way to do it is you could just have a sale agreement with a long closing date that ends up being basically an option as well. And maybe you release portions of the earnest money. That would act like an option, but you don't have to do the whole option paperwork. You just have a sale agreement with a long closing time frame. And so you can do that. Again, check with your local area on if there's any statutory rules on timeframes for contracts, that, you know, you don't want to have a contract that the buyer and seller agree that they're going to close 3 years from now, but maybe there's some statutory thing that says that that's too long. Again, every state's going to have, and city might have slightly different rules about this. And so make sure if you're going to use that tool that you understand kind of what the rules are, if there are any concerns like that, because that's a unique situation.
On the lease option I did way back when, I may or may not have written up the lease option myself. And then a year later I went, wait a second, I wrote up a contract. This isn't the same as filling in the bubbles. I think I just made a huge mistake if this goes sideways. You need to bring in a lawyer for most of this stuff to make sure it gets done right, because there's a difference between being a scrivener, which is what real estate agents are, and writing a little too complicated stuff.
Yeah, I think that's always good advice, is to make sure, again, because even if you know how to do it, every person's personal financial situation is a little different, and you don't want to give people legal advice. You know, give them the advice to talk to an attorney, and if they choose not to, then that's their decision. But you want to at least tell them to do that, to, you know, check and make sure that they're getting what they think they're getting. And the other thing is, even if the buyer and seller love each other and get along great, maybe they're friends, what happens if someone passes away? Now all of that goes to the estate, right? And so how's the estate dealing with it? And they don't know you, the agent, and they're not necessarily in relationship with the other party. And then it just becomes just a contract with a stranger. And so you want to make sure it's clear, and that if you had a conversation that, oh yeah, of course I'll take care of that, or of course we'll fix that, you end up in weird situations too, where we had a client arguing that they wanted the landlord to fix certain things under the lease, but they had already exercised their option to purchase. And it's like, well, you technically are still in your lease, but you're asking them to do all these repairs that you didn't ask them to do last week. And now they're in a situation where they agreed to sell it to you as is. And it created this kind of gray area. And I said, I think once you exercise your option to purchase it, you're now a buyer. And yes, you're still a tenant, but you can't go back and forth and say, yes, I'll buy the property as is, but oh, by the way, my lease says you have to fix X, Y, and Z. It created a lot of consternation. I'll say that, between the buyer and the seller, and the attorneys that like to spend lots of time emailing each other back and forth about little details that, if we had just had the sale agreement done in the first place, it would have saved me and everyone about 3 or 4 months of heartache. And we did finally get that deal done, but man, that was the hardest easy deal I've done in a long time.
So I've seen where I had this agent who was like, you should get paid the second the lease option is signed. But then on the other end is you don't get paid until it closes. Have you done both? Do you have a norm? What do you see on that?
I've done a handful of them, and I've always gotten paid at closing, but I'm changing my tune on that because you are involved the whole time. So I think and again, it depends on the option fee. We're doing one deal right now for a commercial property where the option fee is very large. It's 6 figures. And in hindsight, I would have liked to have gotten my fee paid from that option fee, because we put a lot of work into it. And the seller has had a lot of questions and needs and demands in this process, which they have every right to ask us to do. But it isn't like we just fired off a piece of paper or they docu-signed it and then we didn't talk for 3 years. We're still very heavily involved. And so it was funny that the other broker mentioned to me, oh, hey, make sure when you do these types of deals that you're getting paid when the option fees, when the seller's getting paid these large option fees, that you're getting your percentage, at least on that fee, maybe not on the whole sale, but on that fee. So I think that that's fair. And again, I never felt like it was fair. Like if someone did a lease option on a house and it was a $10,000 option fee, that I'm like, well, my commission's going to be 20 grand. So give me all my money plus the option fee. But maybe, maybe ask for a chunk of that up front, because you're going to be involved for that whole option period. You're basically on call for that whole option period, because it's going to trigger a sale agreement, which is going to trigger all the contingencies, which means a year from now, 2 years, 5 years from now, you have to jump back in and pilot the plane and get it landed.
And if it falls apart, it's not like a deal that fell apart after inspection or 30 days. You're right. There are going to be other conversations. There are other things. It's a unique situation. And yeah, I think, like the one that I had, like I said, it was like $10,000 or what. And it was a situation that they were willing to do to my buyer. And I didn't want to mess it up by saying, well, pay me now or whatever. But I think take it by case and getting something in the beginning is worth it for what we have to do and putting things together, because there is a lot more steps to this, a lot more things to think about.
Yeah, and I mean, you put yourself in a position, right, where your listing agreement's long since expired, and if the buyer doesn't exercise their option, you're out of the game. It doesn't guarantee that you're getting back into it. Maybe you sign a listing extension that extends a listing out 6 years. If they don't exercise their option, you just relist the property. But I don't think that's very realistic. I think it's more fair to just say, hey, how about, I'll take 2,500 of the 10,000. And then obviously if they buy the property, it's coming off your commission at closing. It's not an additional cost to the seller. It's just them giving you some money for the work you've put in so far. And, it also, the seller's more committed to working with you at that point because they've already prepaid part of the commission. So why would they switch to someone else? You've already worked on it and been there, and they've already got that little discount built in. And in the case where the option fee is, really substantial, maybe you take your whole fee. And I think that it depends on the listing contract you sign. I think that you have the right to do it. So I would say you better be really crystal clear with the agents involved what their expectations are, because, if the listing broker wants to hold them to the letter of the contract and they are due the whole fee, and it's a low option fee payment, the seller might have to come out of pocket. And that might not make the deal work for that seller. So just making sure that everyone understands what their agreement is and what what they've agreed to do and how and when they're paying people with a lease option, I think is really critical. So the other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned there's two ways to do a private sale. So again, a lease option is you don't buy the property until you buy it, and then you're just getting traditional financing from a bank. That's kind of the assumption. But if you're buying it on seller carried contract, there's note and trust deed, which is one form, and there's a real estate land sales contract. Now the difference is when you buy a property on a note and trust deed, you take full title to the property, and now you have an encumbrance, which is the loan amount that the seller has. That note, right, is attached to the property, and you have until you pay it off. But you have title and you own the property. When you do a land sales contract, you get what's called equitable title. So you own it, you have all the same rights, but the seller is still on title. And that shouldn't create issues, but it can. And it certainly can create issues for who really owns this and who has the rights on it. If you have a land sales contract, you don't get full title to the property until you pay off the loan. And so typically that happens when the person eventually sells the property, right? The buyer buys it on a land sales contract. And, let's say the property is a fixer and it's not financeable. So you buy it on a land sales contract and you fix it up, you're going to flip it, and you have the right to buy it, right to fix it, right to sell it. But basically you'd only be entitled for like a fraction of a second when you then go to sell it to the end buyer, or you refinance it and then pay off that private loan, and now you have title to the property completely. The big difference is land sales contracts are typically more biased towards the seller's rights, and a note and trust deed is more traditionally in favor of the buyer. I'm of a believer, I've done both. I think a note and trust deed is just so much easier, and I think there's enough protection for the seller to get the property back if they need to. And I just think a land sales contract sometimes can be unfair or overly, biased to one party, which would be the seller. And so if you're going to do a land sales contract, you really have to get an attorney involved to make sure that there isn't something where if you pay late, they can take the property back the next day, that they have to notify you, that you have rights to cure defaults, that it's reasonably fair for both parties. Because I had one where it was really horribly one-sided at the beginning, and it took quite a bit of negotiation to get it to a point where it was just reasonable. Where like literally the post office could, not deliver the check and then you lose the property. It's like, well, that's not fair because I don't even know you didn't get the check. So let's make sure that you have to at least notify someone in certified mail and email them and call them and say, hey, by the way, I didn't get your payment this month, and give someone the chance to fix it. Because there's plenty of times where things go wrong where no one actually did anything wrong. Just a mistake happened, something got forgotten, the postal service delivered it to the neighbor. Any manner of different things can happen. You want to make sure it's fair for everyone.
It wasn't real estate, but I had this service I was looking at, and they had all these rules in there. This happens, you lose this. I'm like, so I'm gonna have all this money in here. I'm gonna have this, and you can just take it away in a second. Well, we would never do that. It's just, I'm like, it's in there for a reason.
No, yeah, get
So
it out of there then.
I'm like, I'm not gonna sign up with you there.
Yeah, no, smart. I mean, make sure you read it.
So many
So
people do not read contracts.
there's plenty more to learn on private financing, but I'm glad you brought it up because I think that a lot of people, there just hasn't been a need to do it. It's been easy to get loans. The
So
rates have been
easy.
great.
Yeah.
And I think now there's a lot more reasons to go out there and do it. And also too, like I said, there's tons of people on social media pitching this whole, I'll teach you how to buy properties with no money down and da 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 da. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. It might not be. It probably is. So make sure you understand what the real risks are, whether you're the seller or the buyer. It goes both ways. So you want to make sure that, like you said, that you're clear on what are the consequences and what are your obligations and what am I really signing up for?
Well, I really appreciate the time you took with me today. If someone wants to get your books, where do they reach you? Buy the books?
Yeah, go to goldenhandoff.com because there's tons of resources there for people to use. It'll link you right to Amazon where you can buy the book or the workbook. I'm in the midst of writing the new chapter on partial handoffs, and I'm really excited that that's underway. The last couple of months, I've been interviewing top agents from all over the country and hearing what worked and what didn't in the real world, and got a ton of great advice that's going to be incorporated in this. Not just my version in my head of how it works, but the real world version. And I'm really excited that that'll be coming out this year, 2023, for depending on when you're listening to this. So watch out for the second edition of Golden Handoff, and the workbook and the audiobook are out there and available now. So that's the best way to find me, and my contact information is on goldenhandoff.com as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. This was great. I love this idea of the partial handoff, and then all this creative financing you talked about. So until next time.
Excellent. Thank you.